Welcome back. I am Rose Martin, and this is Real Life with Susan Harf, our very favorite life coach. And like you, I can't wait to hear what's on her mind today. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Rose. I'm happy to see you. And I'm so glad that you decided to join us today as well. Today we are talking about what happens when an adult child decides to cut off all contact with you as the parent. And it's a tough one.
It is a tough one because I'm thinking, you know, there might be different reasons why they cut off contact. And sometimes it might be okay. And I'm guessing you might tell them, do it. And other times you'll be like, no way, pick up the phone and call home.
You're right. You're right on both counts. It goes something like this. This is what I've been hearing lately. The adult child is in therapy, and they find out while they're with the therapist that in fact, when they were growing up, the parents were any number of adjectives: toxic, abusive, traumatic. And the child didn't necessarily know this until they were in therapy. And so the child comes back from the therapy sessions and they call up the parent. Oftentimes they're not in the same city. And they call up the parent, and this is the situation that I was recently dealing with a client. And the adult child said to the parent, well, I found out that I had a worse childhood than I thought. You traumatized me. You were abusive to me. You were toxic, and I need to cut off all ties with you. And the parent, who was my client, was completely baffled, shocked, and didn't know what to do, because
And often caught off guard, probably.
Completely caught off guard. And from her perspective, the child had a wonderful childhood. They did everything for this child. They toured with her when they looked at colleges. They went to see all the colleges she wanted to. Growing up prior to, she was in dance. She took musical instruments. They went on family trips. They had fun. They enjoyed each other. They had most recently, a couple years prior to this situation happening, they had gone on a European trip together. So this was not at all the recognition that the parent had.
It was almost like they didn't have the same experience growing up.
That's exactly how my client felt.
And I wonder, as a therapist, sometimes a therapist might be wrong or be misinterpreting something, that maybe our perception clouds the way we tell a story, and that's real to us and we're experiencing that way. So you can't minimize it, but maybe drilling down. I don't know. So what's your answer?
Well, first of all, what you said is absolutely the case, that sometimes the therapist is wrong. And sometimes people go to therapists who are either not trained in emotional family cutoff, which is what we call it, or the child and or the therapist is also talking about things that they have heard, not from other clients necessarily, but what is going on in our society today along the lines of social media, along all kinds of lines and things that we hear about, words that are being used in social media, online, about toxicity. Everybody is narcissistic, they're borderline, they're toxic, they're abusive. These are words that are used so casually today, and it changes the scope of how we look at the past. So one of the things that can be happening, like you just said, is that the therapist is wrong.
Yeah.
Another thing that can be going on is that, and I think this is very much the case, that nowadays adult children are in general much more analytical and much more critical of their childhood. The thing about that is that the statistics show that adult children now are more likely to be in therapy as well. And so even if they have a good therapist, a competent therapist, and I almost said, what if they have a young therapist who doesn't have enough experience? And I don't want to get letters about young therapists. I was one. I thought I was competent then, but they may not have the experience that somebody who has faced this a lot with their clients.
But you know, don't you think sometimes they might be blaming their parents for everything wrong in their life, and maybe they made some wrong choices?
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with the parents. You're an adult. You made that choice. No, you can't blame it on them.
Yes, that happens too. But I think we're going to finish the initial conversation about what happens when your child comes to you and says these things. And I want us to have a full appreciation of the fact that things have changed. And one of the things I said that has changed is that we have all this bombardment of social media and others talking about these words like they're everyday words. They're not. The truth is, abusive, toxic, borderline, narcissistic does not describe most parents. Okay, so that's the first thing. We use these words that may or may not apply. Secondly, as I said, the adult child is much more critical and analytical about their past than ever before. And thirdly, there's a lot of study about this now. And there's a new book out, and I want to read this because I want to make sure and give you the correct name. The author is Dr. Joshua Coleman. And the name of the book is Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Off Ties and How to Heal the Conflict. The thing about this issue is this has always been an issue. I've had people in my practice for years who have said just this exact thing. But what's different is that there's a generational divide now, more so than ever, and this is what Dr. Coleman speaks about in his research, between what the adult child thinks constitutes abuse and what the parent thinks is abuse. So it's really like a 30-year gap, and this approach has been developing for 30 years, the approach of more analytics, more critique of the childhood. And so what is the theme here of this issue is that and especially for the parent, and the theme of the confusion for the parent, is that there is a generational divide of what constitutes psychological abuse. And so that's kind of where we need to go with this, because if we first accept the fact that everybody's narcissistic or borderline or is abusive, then we're going in the wrong direction. That is not to say, and I want to spend some time in a couple minutes talking about, well, what constitutes real abuse, because I've got some answers for that. But what we're talking about now is the generational divide that I'm speaking about. So what do you do when your child says, it was all wrong? You were abusive to me, and my best recourse right now is not to talk to you. So that's what we want to think about, is what do you do when your child comes to you and says, the healthiest thing for me to do is to not talk to you anymore because you're abusive.
So would the same advice apply if they don't bother to tell you that, they just break contact and you don't hear from them?
Well, I think the first thing to do in both of those situations, if they've told you or they have not told you, is to make contact with them. Either call them up on the phone, or sometimes I have a client who said, I don't know the phone number. They got a new phone number and I don't even know where she lives.
You know, it's interesting. I talked to my mom about this last night. I said, Mom, how would you feel, I'm one of 5, if all of a sudden one of us just didn't have contact with you anymore? And besides being heartbroken, she told me I would communicate. I would then start to blame myself, because she's thinking, what did I say? What did I do? Maybe I didn't realize that I did something. And she said, I pray. She said, I'm going to say my prayers, and I'm also going to try to make contact over and over and over again. Just keep reaffirming, I love you, I love you, I love you, whatever it is. I love you, call me.
Smart mother. Smart mother you have, Rose. Smart mother. And that's exactly what you need to do, is make contact. Now, you're lucky if the adult child responds to that. When you make contact, because I've had clients say to me when I suggested that, they said, why should I take responsibility for giving her a terrible childhood when in fact I didn't? Making contact with the child does not equal I agree with your assessment of the childhood. It means I want to empathize with what you're going through right now. And your job as the parent in this situation is to do what your mother said she would do. And that is, I want to empathize with what you're telling me. That doesn't mean I agree. And you don't need to say, that doesn't mean I agree with what you're telling me. But I want to empathize. So I'm going to ask you questions. What comes to your mind about your childhood that makes you want this decision? That's something you can say. It's a question. Something also that you can say is, I believe, this is drastic, so I believe that you must think that this is the most healthiest thing that you can do, is to cut off ties with me. And I want to know more about why you believe that's the case and what we can do to try and fix this. What can I do to try and heal this situation? Because I know one thing, I want to be close to you. I want to be close, and I want the relationship that I thought we always had. And as recently as this one client, as recently as a couple years ago when we went on the trip together. So I want to do everything I can that's going to make you more comfortable with me.
What if it doesn't work?
It may not work. And then I say, don't bombard the child with contact every day or every week, but try and keep in some contact with them, knowing that there are reasons why they have made this conclusion. You know, I don't ever think that the child is 100% right. I also don't think that the adult parent is remembering 100% of the childhood in that case. But that's really not the issue, because in my mind, it's, do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? So it doesn't matter who's right. What matters is that we have a harmonious relationship because I care about you and I want you in my life. So the other thing to keep in mind is that many times there are things that work here that don't have to do with you. And one of them is addiction. And I see this sometimes with adult children who have addictions. I also see this with adult children who have mental illness. And thirdly, the situation I see a lot of have seen a lot of as a therapist, is when there's a divorce in the family and the child becomes estranged from one of the parents, not necessarily both. Lastly, I see it when there is a spouse in the picture of the adult child who's asking them to choose. And that can take a lot of different forms. It may not say you choose me or your parents, but it takes the form of punishment when you choose to see your parents. It takes many forms, but overall, that is something that I see too. When the child is asked to choose, more often they're going to choose the spouse.
What do you think the role of siblings are? If I notice that my sister or my brother they're not calling my mom, or they're not making contact, or they're not showing up when they should show up, do you think that's the role of the sibling to pick up the phone and say, what are you doing?
That's a great question. I don't think that anybody has a prescribed role in this. I've seen families cope with this in a myriad of different ways, but I definitely think that if you feel personally offended, put upon, upset, miserable for your sibling, then I think it's completely appropriate to tell them. And if you feel that the relationship is also hampering your relationship with them, I don't have a problem with being honest with your sibling and saying, this is what I see, this is how I feel about it. And that leads me to another part of this, which is the declaration piece. The declaration of, I'm going to tell you that you're not allowed to be with me anymore. That in and of itself tells us a lot, because think about when family members, not necessarily your parents, but anybody who you've decided, I really don't jive with them, and they're crazy, and I don't want to be with them, or whatever's going on in your mind about that relative. More often than not, you slow it up. You don't necessarily see them as much. You don't go out of your way to go across the country to see them, but you might see them at Christmas, you might see them at their birthday. There are times when you do see them, and it shouldn't be, if we're talking about the kind of relationships that we are, where there's more or less a disconnect between what the parent saw as abusive and what the child now is recollecting via the therapy sessions, what was abusive. In that kind of situation, I really think that it's not an absolute. It's not where I have to tell you that I can never speak to you again. And so if that really is the case, that I don't need to tell you that, we live in different cities anyway,
right.
It could be a very organic kind of thing. If instead the adult child chooses to make this declaration, that tells me that they feel a need to have more control over the relationship.
And what about if they put the grandkids into it? They say, well, you know, I'm not talking to you, and you're also not going to see your grandchildren anymore.
And even if they say you can see the grandchildren, it presents such a problem, because if you're not talking as the adult child, if you're not talking to the parent, it creates more of an issue with the grandchildren. So the issue of the control is another piece of this. And what I find too, and what Joshua Coleman talks about in his book, is when in fact the child's making a declaration, it's talking, the issue there is control. And the issue is the adult child doesn't feel like they have control. And there are other ways to get control over yourself and your role in a relationship other than cutting it off. So one of the things that we see when we have this declaration is what we notice is that nowadays, one of the things, I alluded to this earlier, there's a generational divide about the context and about the words that we use to describe these childhoods that were so-called bad, is there used to be a thing called honor thy mother and father. And it was about 30 years ago. Respect the parents just because they're your parents. See your parents just because they're your parents. And honor the parents. Now, this is not one of those things where, and I'm saying this for my children's benefit, this isn't one of those things where the parent says, in my day it used to be. Right. This is empirical evidence that we're talking about, where the generations have changed and the generational relationships have changed. Nowadays, there isn't that dictum of honor thy parents to make you see your family. Now, there's nothing holding you to each other except desire. So in other words, many adult children don't feel beholden to their parents. They don't feel like they need to honor the mother and the father just because they're the parents. I don't happen to agree.
My mother would not agree.
That's for my kids right now.
Yeah,
okay.
my mother would not agree with that either.
No, I don't agree with it. But the empirical evidence suggests that sometimes what is keeping the relationship alive is no more than desire to see the parents. If that's the case and they do something that bothers you or you think is toxic or you don't like, then you're off and running. Then you say, I don't want to see you anymore.
But I wonder if you really want a meaningful relationship if it's only based on duty either, to say, well, the only reason they're here is because we're blood.
True.
And I don't know about that being all that great.
No, but usually if somebody believes that they need to see the parents because they respect them, then things ebb and flow from there. So in other words, you're availing yourself to the relationship at least. We're talking about a situation where you're not.
Yeah, do you think time heals all wounds? It's better to give time if there's this break in a relationship, or is it better to intervene and try to
Another great
heal
question.
it?
I think if your child has made a declaration and has said to you, I don't want to see you anymore, and the most healthiest thing for me to do is to cut off ties with you, I think you need to respond to that. If you feel devastated by that, which most of my clients do, and then I think they need to respond to that, and I think they need to say, and again, respond with empathy, not defensiveness. Not, what are you talking about? That wasn't your childhood. That's not what I'm telling you to say. What I'm saying instead is, what about this? What about your childhood led you to this? Tell me more. I'm glad you're telling me, because the last thing I want is for us to never speak to each other again. So I want you to tell me, what is it that I did and what is it that I can do now to repair our relationship?
You know, and maybe you need some time to put yourself in that mental space,
yes,
so you're not just lashing back out, because you're saying it very calmly. And, you know, but I imagine if your boys came to you out of nowhere and said this to you, you know, your first reaction wouldn't be, well, let's talk about it. You'd be like, ah, you know, what happened? So how do people get themselves in that place to know what's the best direction I should go to heal this or to make contact?
Well, therapists and coaches think highly of therapy and coaching.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell you that I think therapy has helped these clients to work through the emotions that they felt. They felt a lot of guilt. They felt a lot of shame. They felt a lot of fear. And we worked through some of those things. We talked about some of those things. And also I was able to support the client in knowing that when you reestablish a relationship, it does not mean that you agree that you were a horrible parent. You know, I'm thinking about a couple of situations when I was growing up. One is my father used to tell us on a regular basis, you know, we wanted to take you to Carvel. Carvel, where I grew up, was soft ice cream. We wanted to take you to Carvel last night, and we went into your bedroom, but you were asleep, so we couldn't go. Now, that was like a regular part of my childhood. Not one time did I ever think anything negative about that. It was like, oh, darn, I didn't wake up. One time, a colleague of mine said, wow, that was crazy. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, he was constantly telling you it was your fault that you didn't go to the ice cream. I said, you know, that never entered my mind, really, to tell you the truth. So that's an example of something that somebody could turn into a thing, and it was not a thing. And I can also recall other stories I've heard from clients of mine and friends of mine and in my own life where if you were to look at it from an analytical, critical perspective, you could turn it into a whole big hullabaloo. The thing is that what I'm here to say about this subject is don't assume when somebody says to you, my adult child doesn't want to speak to me, don't assume that the situation they created was absolutely horrific. Now, I want to spend a minute or two about talking about what is horrific, because I don't want anybody to get confused that this is what I'm saying. That
you mean time? There are situations and things that happen that you you need to pull yourself away.
That's right.
Okay.
If there is blatant abuse, if there is sexual abuse, if there is blatant neglect, and I have been unfortunate enough to have gone through this with clients, where people have great mental illness and have left their children alone for a period for days. These are people who are court ordered to be in therapy because the children are taken away. If there is true abuse and neglect, and if someone says, well, okay, we get the neglect part, but really what constitutes abuse, and I've already said sexual abuse for absolutely hands down, but there are many other kinds of abuse that truly are abuse. And I would say, if I had to sort of make a generalization, I would say, if the parent chooses you as the child last, if they don't choose you first, if they choose other people before you when it really counts, if they choose their family of origin over you, if they choose their friends over you. I had a client who, when she went to camp, overnight camp every year, when she got on the bus and she looked back and all the kids were waving at their parents, her mother was jumping up and down and hugging her friends. That visual memory for that adult child, my client, stayed with her for a very, very long time. The look of happiness, but that was on her mother's face, but that was a metaphor because her mother treated her like her friends were more important than her. So when there is true abuse, when the parent doesn't choose you as a priority in their life, that's different than the kinds of things we are talking about. And now what I'm seeing more than ever, and apparently, you know, like I said, there's empirical evidence to substantiate that there is a lot of critique going on now, and I think it's substantiated by stuff that we see in the media and online, where there's too much labeling of toxic psychological abuse, trauma, when in fact it's a generational divide as to what we really and truly, how we see that. And the way to fix it, the way to try and heal it, is to make contact yourself, like Rose's mother said, I love you, I want a relationship with you, what do I need to do to make this happen? Try and not be defensive, but instead be empathic, compassionate. I'm so sorry you're going through this. And you don't have to agree that that was the sum total of the childhood. And if you can get to this step also where you understand what they're saying and you say, you know what? I had a blind spot there. I did the wrong thing. Can you forgive me for that? Those are the things you need to say to get the relationship back on track. It's up to you.
And so it's open and it's honest, and sometimes you both have to be really vulnerable. But what about the adult child who now feels guilty because they have stepped away, because things weren't going great, and now the parent is aging or the parent is sick, and they've got the guilt about how to deal with the fact that I've been estranged and I should make it right before something happens.
Well, that's a whole other show, and we're going to talk about when adult children have guilt. But the bottom line is, it's never wrong to begin contact. Even if you have not been in contact with your parent, believe me when I tell you, I have never seen a situation where the parent said, don't bother me, I don't want to talk to you.
And it's kind of never wrong to do the right thing.
Correct.
You know?
It's my old adage, it's never wrong to do the right thing.
So when I think about estrangement, I mean, there's so many layers to this, Susan. There's so many layers about what to do and how to act, and then reaching out. And sometimes that initial 30 seconds of courage to pick up the phone and to address it. And then once the floodgates are opened, then maybe there's meaningful dialogue and there's things that can happen to heal that.
Especially when the parent comes from a healing place, an empathic place, a compassionate place, and doesn't instead seek to defend their position and defend how they were as a parent. Because it's really not about that.
It's about love.
It is about love.
It's about loving.
Yes.
Susan, thank you. It's been wonderful and so informative, I think, helpful to so many people. The special thanks to our favorite life coach, Susan Harf. I'm Rose Martin for Real Life. We'll see you again next time. Thanks for watching.